This is Notes on Quotes. I'm Stephen Harrison, and the premise of this series is that I'm simply interviewing really fascinating people about a quotation of their choosing. My guest for this episode is the New York Times bestselling author David Epstein. He wrote The Sports Gene back in 2013. More recently, he wrote Range, Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World. And I reached out to David because I really loved his book Range, and this whole idea that maybe there's a benefit to having a wider variety of skill sets and a little bit more of a diverse background. And if you are new to David Epstein, I'd encourage you to check out his TED Talk, which is about innovation in sports. It's been viewed over 7 million times on YouTube. And whenever I have a guest on these shows to talk about a quote, I'd like to pick a quote that kind of describes the guest. And my one for this episode is a quote by Malcolm Gladwell about David Epstein. And Malcolm Gladwell said this: "For reasons I cannot explain, David Epstein manages to make me thoroughly enjoy the experience of being told that everything I thought about a subject was wrong." And that's actually been my experience with David Epstein too. He really encourages you to think a little bit more deeply. He kind of challenges your assumptions. In our conversation, we talked a lot about sports, philosophy, interesting things like gamification. And he picked this just really great quote that led to a lot of on-air philosophizing in the show. So before we start, I wanted to say that you can get this and all the episodes of Notes on Quotes, as well as the print versions of the interviews, at notesonquotes.com. You can also follow us on social media on all the different platforms: Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, at Notes on Quotes. You can follow me, Stephen, with PH Harrison, on those same platforms, and you can read some of my other writing, which has been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, Slate, and others. And I'd really encourage you to subscribe to the series on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm pretty sure that Notes and Quotes is going to be a really fun interview series. And with that, I will start the episode. Thanks. David, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Which quote are we chatting about today?
So the quote I chose is from a book called The Grasshopper, written by a Canadian philosopher named Bernard Suits. And the quote is, "Playing a game is the voluntary attempt to overcome unnecessary obstacles." And in the book, that quote is actually spoken by the character of the grasshopper.
David, I'm really happy you picked this quote because it was a total surprise to me. In your book Range, you quote some well-known figures like Tolstoy and Oliver Wendell Holmes, but I didn't spot a single Bernard Suits quote. So I was wondering when you first came across his writing.
I first came across it when I was doing investigative work at Sports Illustrated, because I was writing quite a bit about malfeasance in the sports world, I guess, and quite a bit about doping. And I would get feedback from people, letters from readers basically saying, "Why are you doing this? You're a killjoy, like nobody cares. Stop writing about these things." And I took that feedback, seriously. And I started to wonder if it was worth trying to expose like drug use in sports or not. And so I started trying to read philosophy about sports, and one thing led to another. And I ended up with this book, The Grasshopper. And the premise, it's sort of a kind of a reversal of one of Aesop's fables. So there's a famous fable about a grasshopper and an ant, and basically the grasshopper is playing all summer essentially while the ant is working to store food. And then when the winter comes, the grasshopper has been playing, and so the grasshopper doesn't have food and goes to the ant and asks for food, and the ant says, "Sorry, you weren't working when it counted." And it's this fable, and the idea being you have to sow if you want to reap later. You have to work. You can't just play around. And Bernard Suits' book, The Grasshopper, has a different take on that, where the grasshopper is playing games and knowingly heading toward disaster, not storing food. And the book is sort of an explication of the grasshopper to his followers of why he's going to continue doing that, even though it means that he will die come winter. And really what the book is an attempt to respond to a previous philosophical debate where Wittgenstein said that there's games in sports are indefinable. There are no necessary and sufficient conditions you could articulate for games. And Suits says that's wrong. And in the book, the grasshopper comes to the conclusion that the core premise that unites games and sports is the voluntary acceptance of unnecessary obstacles. And so that's sort of I started to think that it was meaningful to report on the things I was reporting on. Maybe that was self-justifying, but that the greater meaning from sports and games emanates from those unnecessary obstacles that are voluntarily accepted. And if you're short-circuiting those, you're kind of short-circuiting the core meaning of those endeavors.
Since you picked this quote, I take it that you endorse the Bernard Suits view over the Wittgenstein view of games. Is that right?
I do, but there are things in the Grasshopper that I do disagree with. Like there are sort of extremes. I mean, in the Grasshopper, Suits is talking about in a utopia where nobody has to work for anything, everyone would just be engaged in game playing all the time. And I think that, it gets taken to sort of an extreme extension, whereas I guess I started to apply it to things that don't have much of anything to do with games and sports as the quote sort of became more meaningful in other areas of life to me, even if I was maybe taking it in a direction that Bernard Suits didn't intend.
I wanted to do a close reading of the quote, which again is playing a game is a voluntary attempt to overcome unnecessary obstacles. David, what do you make of those last two words, unnecessary obstacles?
I think in the sense that Suits was using it, he's basically saying all games and sports have sort of an end that you could achieve in a much more efficient way, right? Like you could get a ball across one line or over a wall like very easily by just walking there and dropping it. But instead you put up these unnecessary obstacles that make it more difficult. And so I think one aspect of what he's talking about in games and sports is that there's an aspect of loving difficulty for itself, and that is its own value, the love of difficulty for itself. And so I think that's what he's talking about, making efficient things less efficient, and that there's inherent value in that. And that kind of, honestly, I felt like that related to some of the things I was writing about in Range in a certain way, where I talk about some of the benefits of long-term benefits of being inefficient in certain areas of work, even if that means things are sort of harder in the short run.
Yeah, as you said, your book Range really makes this argument that slow or inefficient learning can be more effective. Do you think that the most or the best games tend to be sort of inefficient in a way?
I think so. I mean, if we think about what these games actually are, right? Like if you take something like soccer, again, the ends could be done putting the ball in the goal much more efficiently, but it is the difficulty that I think the meaning emanates from, and I don't want to be like too grandiose about it, but I think that's sort of similar to life in the sense that you kind of take rules and add meaning, basically. And that's what you're doing with sports. You take these contrived rules that are meaningless until you add meaning to them, and the meaning is conferred, I think, by the love of the difficulty that you're adding to it. And so I do think that relates to the way that I think about life. If you just, you take what's there and add meaning to it the same way that you do with games, even though with games it's a much more explicit process.
And you mentioned that you came across this quote when you were writing at Sports Illustrated, and that a lot of your writing had to do with doping. Do you think that one of the problems of doping is that it sort of tries to circumvent the rules of the game?
Yeah, I do. And because I think that, and I understand it, and I'm not like a purist about it and think that everyone who dopes is a bad person by any stretch of the imagination. That said, I do think the kind of larger values that we often give lip service to about sports do emanate from that voluntary acceptance of unnecessary obstacles. And if you're kind of not abiding by the same sort of social contract as the other people who are accepting difficulty and loving the difficulty for itself, I think there's just something that's taken away from it. And I don't think that makes it not entertaining. I don't think that makes it bad or the people bad. But I do think it lowers the level of achievement and the level of meaning.
I was trying to think before about how broad this definition of a game is. And one of the things I came across was Bernard Suits writing that work is not a game. It doesn't fall within this definition. It's something outside of a game. Do you think that's right, that sort of work itself is not a game?
That's where I sort of diverge with Suits. And again, he's making like a very purist argument in a utopia. And I disagree. And I think some other sort of philosophers that I read to follow up on who agreed with a lot of his premise and his response to Wittgenstein. But, did not agree with that point, and I don't. And where my mind first goes when I think about that is artistic creation, right? Artistic creation is work for a lot of people. And I think artistic creation has some of the characteristics that Suits defines in games, right? There's often a goal that you could get to in an easier way or a more efficient way to make the product, but it's something about the act of creation that also is inherently valued in the process. I mean, there is an end, that the end goal in artistic creation is important, but the process is incredibly important, not just to the people doing it, but also to the people consuming it. You mentioned I quoted Tolstoy in Range. I like Tolstoy, and that makes me, this issue of artistic creation makes me think of War and Peace, because when Tolstoy was asked what it is, because there was this controversy about whether it was a novel or not when he wrote it, because it has these historical essays and all this. And he said, it is that which the author could express in no other way. And so I think that is an end, right? He had this end goal to express something that was otherwise inexpressible, but also clearly valued the process of doing that and the kind of thinking he was forced into while doing that. And I think that's true of all artistic creation. Like some of the relations that artists form, whether it's between visual or written or musical, they're kind of defining beauty, which I guess is an end, but I think it's inextricable from the process, if that makes sense. They're taking on something difficult purposefully. And I think there's some writing that reflects on Suits that relates to Aristotle, who divided activities into these two categories, kinesis and energia, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And basically, kinesis was, it's a thing that aims at external goals, like you, whatever, build a skyscraper or something like that. And energia were activities that are inherently valuable just in and of themselves, absent any goal whatsoever. And I think Aristotle's kind of prime example of that was philosophical contemplation itself. And yet I think there's some of these tasks from artistic creation, other areas of work too. Artistic creation is just the one that I sort of started with as a non-confirming example, I guess, for some of Suits' thesis, where there is inherent value in doing the building and in the end product. So I would definitely disagree with Aristotle. So I think you can have that love of the process and the love of the difficulty with a goal that's important in the end too.
I like this idea that artistic creation itself can be a game. And one example I liked from your book was Jordan Peele, who credited his background in comedy writing for the success of his hit horror film, Get Out. And what he was actually doing is taking some of the skill sets he learned from the genre of comedy and applying them to another, which is horror. But I had this idea based on that I wanted to ask you about. And do you think that these sort of genre crossers, like Jordan Peele in that example, are breaking the rules of the game?
No, I don't think so. In fact, I guess my first, and again, maybe this is because I picked this quote, I'm sure I have a ton of confirmation bias around this quote. But the first thing my mind jumps to is that Jordan Peele very easily could have kept doing what he was doing and been very successful at it. But my feeling is that he must have some of that love of difficulty in order to make a leap that in retrospect looks obvious, like a genius move, but I'm sure prospectively was a real risk for him. And, and I think Get Out was, I actually, because of one story I wrote, I remember I was talking to Allison Williams actually about a story I wrote, because she bought the rights to a story I wrote at ProPublica. And she was saying, when she was wanting to do Get Out, like a lot of people were telling her, like, this isn't really the way you want to go. It wasn't a huge budget. It's a, new director, new genre and things like that. So of course it's genius in retrospect, but I think he was he was showing some of that love of difficulty in choosing to make that move that only in retrospect seems like brilliant.
That makes sense. And you write in your book a lot about a lot of people who have changed careers entirely. Like there's the example of Van Gogh, who kind of went through seemingly every career before he found painting. And also the many people who have left careers in the armed services as officers before doing something else. And I like this idea that there's a broader definition of the game. Do you think the career switchers are sort of changing the game?
That's an interesting question. I didn't think of them as changing the game, because I'm not sure, other than that sort of way zoomed out game of life sort of thing, where I think a lot of them are looking to kind of add meaning to the things that they're doing, right? Because those are usually not not easy moves to make. And they're inefficient, right? So I think they're embracing a certain kind of development, and part of the sort of more abstract part of the quote that resonates with me is this idea that the fastest way to develop is often not the best way to develop in the long term. But I don't know how to think about them if they are changing the rules of the game. What do you think? Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, it's a good point. Well, I think it kind of depends on if, as you said, if the game is live, then obviously they're playing within the same game. But if it's, I don't know, being an army officer or a lawyer or a writer, it's sort of they've changed games, but they're also changing games or changing sports almost is maybe an easier way to think about it to as you said, the one that fits them best, right? It's kind of, but again, it all comes down to if you think that something like business, for example, can fall within the Bernard Suits definition of a game.
I do think it can. And actually that comes up. I can't remember exactly who it was that wrote specifically about, it may have even been sort of a newer edition of the Grasshopper that had an introduction. I'm not sure. I'd have to go back and read it. But somebody definitely commenting on Suits wrote specifically about business and said, obviously the ends, of a company are to make a product or make money or make their shareholders money. But that, in fact, if you read like the business pages, the coverage is very, very sports-like, right? And I think for a lot of people, this isn't my attitude about it, but I think for a lot of people, in big business, which, might be on its face the farthest away from the kind of things we're talking about. And yet, I think for a lot of people, the money is like the way they keep score, essentially. It's like their version of fantasy football. And so I do think it can meet that criteria. But I think to some degree, maybe it depends a little bit on what Suits called the illusory attitude, which was essentially your acceptance of these rules in order to facilitate kind of the experience of playing. So I think some of it would have to do with, are they valuing the experience or is it only for an end? So I would say, for the people who are in business and they're willing to cheat and steal and make money by any means necessary, I would say they have dropped the illusory attitude. And so I don't think they're seeing the value in the process itself.
There's kind of that ethical dimension you mentioned, and then also when you are speaking about this idea of money being the way that these business people keep score, that's also the way the penalties can be put in. I'm thinking of criminal justice penalties and fines and things that can be levied.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting. And I mean, I guess in one sense, and again, this is a personally meaningful quote, so I can do whatever I want with it in my head.
You're allowed. Yeah.
Yeah. But I also want to be careful of, have I already made this quote like the container into which I can fit anything, right? And I want to be careful about that, because I do think it matters how we go about those things. So I think two people could be doing the same thing and not embodying some of the values Suits was talking about, the illusory attitude and things like that. Again, if you are circumventing, right, like in some respect, doping or any form of cheating in something that is constructed as a game where the process itself is supposed to have value, if you're circumventing the obstacles that you voluntarily accepted, then I think you're no longer playing a game in the way that Suits would describe it.
David, your book makes the argument that developing broad interests is often better as a strategy than narrow specialization. And in the book, you write about this concept of kind learning environments, which are more straightforward, versus wicked learning environments. And you talk about this imaginary game that I like called Martian Tennis. I was wondering if you could talk about the game of Martian Tennis for our listeners.
Yeah, so I guess I should define kind and wicked learning environments a little bit first.
That too, yeah.
Those are terms coined by the psychologist Robin Hogarth. And a kind learning environment is essentially one where all the information is available, next steps and goals are very clear, rules never change from year to year, patterns repeat, and when you do something, you get feedback that is immediate and perfectly accurate. And those are domains where you get better just by doing the same thing over and over, like golf. On the other end of the spectrum are wicked learning environments where next steps and goals are not handed to you. There may or may not be rules, and they may change without notice. Work next year might not look like work last year. You may or may not get feedback, and it's often delayed and often inaccurate. And so that's kind of a spectrum And in the wicked learning environments, when people do this sort of specialized practice over and over, they often end up reinforcing the wrong kind of learning and development. And in kind environments, they reinforce the right kind of learning. And what Hogarth meant by Martian tennis is he said, we can think about things like certain types of sports and activities on the kind to wicked spectrum, but most of us aren't even playing tennis. We're playing Martian tennis, which is you see people playing or doing some activity, but nobody's told you the rules. It's up to you to deduce them, and they could change in a moment's notice. So most of life and most of the complex things we want to learn, he argues, are in fact Martian tennis.
Okay, David, the quote again goes like this: playing a game is a voluntary attempt to overcome unnecessary obstacles. And you said before that part of the reason this quote resonates with you is because it is about someone voluntarily taking on a desirable difficulty. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, desirable difficulties are something I've written about quite a bit. And I want to give like a really funny example here. And Suits was not talking about how people get better at things. He was talking about games himself. But again, because I've used this quote in my own head for my own purposes, I think about it very much in terms of how people get better at stuff and how I myself try to get better at stuff. And so a while ago when I was reading speed typing literature, okay, I know that sounds really funny, but basically my conclusion was most people just from typing, they get to like 50 to 80 words a minute. And then for whatever reason, our central nervous system is happy there, whatever. We just settle into that good enough. But you can get like twice as fast. But what you have to do is basically get like a metronome and turn it up a little faster than you can type and follow it no matter how many mistakes you make. And it's hard and it's kind of frustrating, but you keep doing that every few days and you can get like twice as fast. And I think of that as sort of a microcosm for these desirable difficulties where the way to I think our natural tendency is to get good enough at something and then we kind of settle into basically a rut of competence and keep doing the same thing over and over. And that's kind of like lifting the same weights the same number of times every day. You won't get worse, but you won't get better. And so I've kind of internalized that and both wrote about it with respect to learning in range, but also kind of tried to apply it to my own career where I will do what I think sometimes looks to people from the outside like pretty silly career moves. But the goal has been to go from feeling competent to feeling less competent because I think it's those that pursuit of difficulty that actually helps you continue getting better so you don't get in that sort of rut of competence, basically.
I think typing is a good example, right? Because people could continue on sort of with their mediocre typing, or they can kind of strive to overcome the unnecessary obstacle to actually get significantly better over time.
Yeah, and there is an end goal again. They are trying to get better. And so I guess Suits again would say, well, it depends on if they're finding value in the process of this. And I think I certainly do. I mean, again, like when I was a staff writer at Sports Illustrated, shortly after I became a staff writer, I left to become an intern at ProPublica. So I went from, having like a big window over 6th Avenue to like scanning documents for another reporter from one week to the next. And I remember the internship coordinator when I applied was kind of like, do you realize what you're applying for? And I did. And I think that was the way that I could think of to get better, to go to a place where I was totally uncomfortable and learn these new things. And I think I both valued that process and the end, and I've kind of continued to do that, like job hopping and project hopping and things like that. And, I don't want to like compare, you mentioned Jordan Peele, and I think what he did was, again, sort of risky at the time, but I think that's how you get better at stuff and how you find out how to get better at things is by once you become competent, because you get better at things just by doing them in the early part of a learning curve, many things. But pretty soon, you have to seek out the difficulty, the unnecessary obstacles if you want to continue getting better. And again, Suits would not say the goal is to get better. The goal is to enjoy the process. But this is how I was allowed to pick the quote, and this is how I've repurposed the quote for my own life philosophies.
I wanted to ask a little bit about this idea of personality and comfort, because your book kind of talks about two different types of personalities. They're the hedgehog experts who have a very narrow interest. They're the people who know their very specific subject matter, whereas foxes have a broader range of knowledge. They're the ones who dance across disciplines and are comfortable with ambiguity. You write a lot about hedgehogs and foxes in industry. I was just wondering, for purposes of this quote, do you think that a fox or a hedgehog would think about the game or a game differently?
That's a really interesting question. My feeling is that, and I think there's a huge amount of variation for individuals there. But again, the foxes and the hedgehogs, these came out of this famous 20-year study of people making geopolitical and economic forecasts. And it turned out that the worst forecasters were like scholars who'd spent their entire career on one or two problems, and they came to see the entire world through a single lens or mental model. And some of them actually got worse as they accumulated credentials and experience because they had this very narrow view. And the best forecasters were these very fast generalists, people who could learn very broadly and quickly. And I think the people who engaged in that study must have, they didn't have to. It was voluntary to make these incredibly difficult predictions, like, will there be a conflict that has at least 10 casualties in the, East China Sea within the next year? Like, these are really hard questions. And so I think people must have enjoyed taking those on. And my feeling was that the foxes, the best forecasters, were much more in it for the joy of the pursuit. It was much more of an unnecessary obstacle for them, right? They were like people from the general public in many cases, whereas the most esteemed colleagues, as Philip Tetlock, who led this work, said, there was a perverse inverse relationship between fame and accuracy. So the people who had this single mental model and could talk really authoritatively, made for good TV, but they also didn't make for good forecasters. And I think for some of those people, they were very much in it for the status or the reputation. And the really broad people my interactions with them suggested to me that they are intensely curious, and that's the way they live. And the fact that the reason they do these prediction contests is because they have this love of learning broadly and of challenging themselves and being held accountable for their own predictions, right? That's a big difference with some of these good forecasters, these foxes, is they hold themselves accountable for their own thinking, which in some ways I would say is an unnecessary thing to do because the most famous experts actually basically never get held accountable on TV or anything like that for their predictions. So I do think that on balance, even though there's plenty of individual variability, the foxes were more in it for the pursuit and the difficulty and the way that it forced them to try to learn things. So, and I think Suits might even address the fact of, he says there's a difference between truth and the search for truth, right? If you could just have truth implanted in your brain, like downloaded, that would be, that would not be the voluntary attempt to overcome unnecessary obstacles. But if the search for truth itself has some value, then you may be searching for truth in not the most efficient way. And I do think that rings true for the foxes, where they do not attempt to be as efficient as they can when they're learning about something. They actually spread themselves very broadly. So I think they value the truth, but I think the search for the truth itself is a very important component of their thinking.
That's a good point about the experts who are foxes being accountable for their predictions. And as you said, just in our culture, that's sort of a burden they're taking on themselves. It really is, as you said, to use the language of the quote, an unnecessary obstacle.
Yeah, and maybe an unnecessary challenge to their identity in some ways too, right? Like, because if you're wrong a lot, that's not really fun. I think some of the most narrow sort of experts, sometimes when they would make very wrong forecasts, and I think when the experts said something was a sure thing, it failed to happen like a quarter of the time. And when they said something was impossible, it still happened like 15% of the time or something like that. And sometimes when they were faced with results like this, they would actually update their beliefs in the wrong direction, having like more confidence in the beliefs that had sent them astray. And I think there's something very odd about that, and that they're not engaging in this search for truth in the most sort of honest way. It's not that there are explicit rules, but I think they're kind of breaking what would be the good rules of thinking, even though those aren't explicit.
Gamification is popular these days. It's the application, as you know, of game design and game principles to non-game contexts. For example, companies might launch a step challenge for their employees encouraging them to take 10,000 steps per day or compete against their coworkers. Do you think that this quote from Bernard Suits has anything to say about gamification?
That's a really interesting question because I think about gamification sometimes, and I think it does because obviously the game is being used, but not perfectly. The game, for a step challenge, for example, is being used to motivate people, essentially. And that works, right? So are those people, they definitely have a goal, right? Is it to be more fit? So they have an end goal. And is there a joy in the process, right? I think they are, if their goal is to win, then by not cheating or whatever, sharing their Fitbit with someone else who's also taking a lot of steps or whatever it is they could do to cheat, then they are participating in a type of game. But I don't know if that kind of gets to the core of what Suits is thinking about, because I think that is a lot more about finding something to motivate you to an end as opposed to the love of difficulty for itself aspect and the doing things you don't have to do. And so I don't think it's a perfect fit with at least like a step challenge with what Suits was thinking about. But I wish he were alive and could kind of argue that, because I think it would be really interesting to hear what he would say about that. What do you think about gamification?
I was inspired by some things that you just said. It seems like a step challenge if it's about getting these little badges or these little rewards or even just beating your friends in the number of steps. That's maybe a little bit more of an extrinsic motivation, whereas the way my new interpretation of this Bernard Suits quote is that it's a little bit more about the voluntary or the intrinsic motivation a person has to pursue the unnecessary obstacle. It's a little bit a question of motivation.
Yeah, I agree. And I think if you're purely motivated by the end, because there is, if the end is health or beating your friends or whatever, as long as you're not cheating, there sort of is no way to short circuit that, right? And so there's not that much in the way of unnecessary obstacles that are really being embraced, I wouldn't say. So I don't think it's a perfect fit. That's not to say there's anything wrong with using that to motivate people by any stretch of the imagination. I just don't know that it would meet the Suits definition of a sport or game.
David, your quote has me curious about the future of games. You write and range about chess and how human teams already play games together with computers, and these combination teams known as centaurs. It seems to me that Bernard Suits has this definition of a game that's pretty fluid or pretty flexible, although it might exclude gamification. But David, what are your thoughts on the future of games and this quote?
I think games are becoming bigger business, right? And so there's a lot more, maybe there's going to be more challenge, again, where I was talking about where we see as sports have become bigger and bigger business, you see people cheating in more ways. And I think that violates that illusory attitude where you're sort of agreeing to this kind of social contract. And so I think we'll lose the meaning from some of those games, but also I think we will, in some ways, maybe even already have take a step toward the kind of utopia Suits was talking about. I don't mean to, like, the utopia and the grasshoppers, everyone's basic needs are taken care of. And so it's utopia because you do the thing of the most value once your basic needs are taken care of. And that's, embracing difficulty for its own sake and doing things that have meaning just in the process. And I think we have a lot more people we have a huge number of people are engaging in an extraordinary amount of gaming. And I think it's going to be like games are going to cross domains in lots of new ways. I think some interesting AI is going to allow other people to start, people who don't know how to program, to create games. So people will often become creators of games who wouldn't have before, and we'll see what kind of difficulties do they set up, and will this help society think about like what is the optimal level of difficulty for different things that we want to do. I think games will be involved in research, right? We've already seen that somewhere. A game was made where people could try to fold proteins in a certain way, and it actually like assisted research. So I don't know. I mean, I think the core of games will stay similar, but I do sort of wonder what Suits would think about, like, if we get to virtual reality, total immersion games where essentially what you're doing is just living another life. I'd be really curious what he would say about something like that. And I'm not sure.
I'd be curious too. And it goes to the point of whether that virtual reality life is sort of the Utopia vision or the opposite, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, maybe I don't know enough about like the total immersion games. And obviously, if someone's playing a video game, for example, they are playing the game because there's difficult stuff to do. So they're certainly embracing that. There's a goal at the end, they want to win or whatever. But again, the entire value does come from doing things you don't have to do and accepting difficulty that you don't have to accept. So I do think video games would tend to meet his definition in that sense, right? Because the whole thing is just accepting contrived difficulty. But I do wonder, as it becomes bigger business and more pervasive, and do you lose some of the value that emanates from it? Not to say there's something bad with it being commercialized, but I do wonder.
It's sort of like when professional athletes were allowed to enter the Olympics and not just amateurs.
Yeah, and that changed a lot of things, and I think that's I think that's been good. Like, it's been really interesting. It's interested more people in sports, but it's also had these bad side effects where you see for sure, like, the sport becomes something different, right? And sometimes you'll hear that from pro athletes if they become disenchanted. It's like, well, it went from something that they loved to do to becoming a job. And I think what they mean when they're saying that is that the process part, the energeia, as Aristotle would put it, that part's gone, and you're only doing it for the end. And at that point, I think that's when a lot of people cheat. But at that point, I think the central meaning that Suits was alluding to is kind of lost for a lot of people. And I think we're increasingly doing that. We're increasingly making sure that that's the case for younger and younger kids, which is kind of unfortunate.
Hey, David, you were telling me a little before the show that you extend sort of the principles of this quote, not just to traditional games like soccer, but to your family life. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I've been thinking about this because I'm a very new parent. And again, this quote, if it were only about sports and games, I don't think it would mean as much to me. And whether appropriately or not, I think I extend it to, a certain value that can be found really in any activity, where part of the value of the activity is its difficulty. And for me right now, I think that's, that can be a work project, that can be activism. But for me right now, that includes raising a kid, where I do think part of the shared value, and I feel this way, and I think from talking to other new parents, they feel this way, that part of the shared value actually is the difficulty of doing it itself. And so even if that seems like a stretch of an extension, I actually think it's like it exactly fits with the core of the Suits quote.
Hey, David, one of the themes of range is that slow and inefficient learning can be more effective. And I'm curious on your thoughts. Do you think that the best games tend to be sort of inefficient? Maybe you could use an example like soccer.
Yeah, I think absolutely, right? Soccer, the goal is, to get the ball in the goal. And you could do that very easily without a bunch of people trying to impede your progress, and without offsides rules, right? That would make things a lot easier. And yet that would take the value entirely away, right? It would be like in golf, it's easy to get the ball into the cup. You can walk up and drop it in, but that completely removes the voluntarily accepted unnecessary obstacles and completely, despoils the activity of its central values. And so I think that inefficiency, doing something that could be done more efficiently, intentionally inefficiently, is very much a central value expressed in the Suits quote.
Can you talk a little bit about the inefficiencies of your own career? You mentioned that you'd had a number of different roles, both at ProPublica and at Sports Illustrated.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was living in a tent in the Arctic when I decided for sure I wanted to become a writer. So I was training to, at one point I thought I was going to become a geologist. And so I sort of got off track. And when I arrived at Sports Illustrated, I was, 6 years older than, I was a temp fact checker, and I was like 6 years older than people I was doing the temp fact checking for. But it turned out that my very circuitous path, right, my sort of ordinary science skills were suddenly extraordinary in the context of a sports magazine. I didn't know that prospectively, only retrospectively. Or I realized it once I got there, but I didn't realize it ahead of time. And so I think I took this sort of very circuitous path to get there. And then once I felt like my learning curve was kind of leveling off, I left and I went, from being a staff writer at Sports Illustrated to being an intern at ProPublica at one point. So I've moved down the masthead quite a number of times, put it that way. And I've always done it for the purpose of seeking out some difficulty that I thought would both challenge me, and make me better and make me feel like a beginner again in some ways. I like this concept, the Zen concept of the beginner's mind, and I think if you're losing that and only doing things you're already competent at, then you're missing out on some unnecessary obstacles that will actually make you a lot better at what you do.
David, thanks so much for coming on the show. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Cool. This is such a cool idea. I'm really looking forward to becoming a devoted listener.
Thanks for listening to Notes on Quotes. Again, I'm Stephen Harrison. Our theme song is Water and Bridges by Joshua Heffernan. Our transcriptions of each episode are done by Sarah Baum of Sharp Copy Transcription. Check out our website, notesonquotes.com, for the archive of all previous episodes, and you can also get the print versions of all of these interviews. Sign up to get the notes delivered directly to your inbox and help support the series. Follow us on Instagram at Notes on Quotes, and don't forget to subscribe to the podcast in whichever platform you choose. Thanks again.